Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. How can Canada win this trade conflict? Well, we've talked about that on a lot of podcasts. There is a path to that. Step one, as I've mentioned on the podcast many before, the step one in trying to win this whole thing with the United States is for the heaven's sakes, don't listen to the empty, mindless, unsubstantiated rhetoric from Pierre Poilievre as to what's really going on, because he has no idea. And he just simply wants to pollute the water. It's pretty obvious that Poilievre is not interested at all in getting a great deal for Canada. He just wants to take shots at the government and spread falsehoods about this to try to get public opinion on his side. He's still bitter that he's lost the election. I guess he's never going to get over that. But you got to put that in perspective. What we do need to do, though, is focus on what can be done. And there was a great piece in the National Post just a couple of days ago by John Iverson. John, of course, is an award-winning journalist and commentator. I've known John for a long time now. He's been a guest on the radio show many, many times. He is, I guess by description, a small C conservative, not a radical like some of the folks that we've talked about on some of these podcasts. He's thoughtful. He does his research. Before he comes and says, this is how I feel about this, he presents the facts that substantiate that. What a novel idea. Wish some people in the House of Commons would do that more often. But John's piece in the National Post says, how to win a trade war. Appeal to Canadian patience and American self-interest. Now, two very important points. And we've talked about this, but I wanted to get John's perspective on this because he lays it all out here in a way that I hope most Canadians can understand. That, this is going to take some time. He's referencing Dominic LeBlanc, of course, who is the point man, of course, for the Carney government in these negotiations with Washington these days. LeBlanc appeared before a parliamentary committee just a couple of days ago to basically give an update on what's going on here. And it conflicts, I think, with Poilievre's very tilted view of things that says that Canada has elbows down, is getting trampled by the Trump administration. Well, yeah, the tariffs hurt. Okay, we got that. But what are we going to do about this? And the Prime Minister has always preached, and John talks about this in his column, that we're going to have to be patient. You got to play the long game with this guy. Donald Trump he's one of these guys that's very reactionary. How many times have you seen him in the speeches saying tariff is my favorite word in the English language? Which is probably not a big deal because I don't think he knows that many words in the English language. But anyway, it's not going to go away. Let's first of all deal with that reality. He's not going to wake up one day and say, you know what, I've been wrong about this whole thing. Let's sit down and negotiate a fair deal for everybody involved. That's not Donald Trump. It's never going to happen. Nor should we accept the deal that some of these other countries have quote unquote made. And again, I'll reiterate what John talks about in the column. The UK, Japan, all these other places, the European Union, that have made deals with Trump. There's nothing in paper. No, there are no details about any of this stuff. What they have agreed to is in principle of basic tariffs on just about everything. Well, we've already decided in this country that's not going to be good enough. That's not the answer to what's going on. And we're actually doing this trade negotiations or discussion. I'm not even sure if it's a negotiation on two different levels. There's, first of all, of course, there's the reorganization and the redrafting of the Kuzma deal, the trade deal between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. But then there is, separate and apart from that, the tariffs that Trump has put on to steel and aluminum especially, and a number of other products that are having an adverse effect on our economy. And as John Iverson points out in the piece, you've got to approach this with a strategy. And the strategy here is no deal if it's not a good deal for Canada. That's fair. The other is, and this is something where the patience area comes in, and something that we need to focus on, that we have to be patient about this and give our government some time to do what needs to be done here. As we talked about it, many economists have talked about since tariffs started and this Trump idiocy started with international trade, it's hurting the American economy a lot more than Trump wants to admit. And some of those cracks are starting to show. We already talked about unemployment numbers going up, and he was very pissed off that report came out. Remember, he fired the department, the guys that released that report. And basically, you hired them with people that are going to bury all those numbers. But the numbers are starting to come out now, and it's a pretty stark picture for the U.S. economy. They're not at the bottom by any stretch of the imagination, but there are some signs that the economy in the United States is starting to fall down, just as we predicted. That once the pressure is on not just the White House in the United States, but states and House of Representatives and senators, they start hearing from their constituents about things like high prices, and having to pay more for lumber, having to pay more for homes because lumber's expensive, having to pay more for cars if they can even afford a car, because of the price of steel, and on it goes. That's starting to happen. It's not happening as fast as we want. Okay, I get that. I've been accused of being impatient before by my family and by friends, and mea culpa. I guess I am. A lot of us are. It happens when there's something that you really, really, really want. You want it right away. And sometimes it's hard to be patient and play the long game, but that's the only way that we're going to be successful in these negotiations. We've got to let those employment numbers in the states start to unemployment numbers creep up. When the price of groceries continues to rise, and it is rising in the states, that's going to continue. That's going to be a factor. When all of a sudden there's not going to be enough aluminum products for the Americans because of the fact that, the tariffs that Trump has put on have made us, I think, wisely start looking for other markets. The aluminum is going to other places, not just to the United States. And that's that whole idea about diversifying trade that the Prime Minister's talked about for quite some time. And this stuff about, national security has been Trump's premise, a false premise, really, for justification for doing all the stuff that he's done. It's a hollow argument. We know that. And that's going to go before the Supreme Court in the first week of November, I think it is. Now, I personally am not confident that they're going to actually rule fairly in this, because they've just given Trump a rubber stamp to anything he wants to do. However, 2 lower courts have already said that what Trump is doing is illegal. So there is a path here for the Supreme Court to simply say, hey, you can't be doing that. That might or might not happen, but we can't count on that. What we can count on and must count on is being patient about this and continuing with the line of thought about you getting the best deal here for Canada. Let those cracks show in the U.S. economy. Let the pressure start to happen to Trump. It did in the first term. Remember, he did put tariffs on, not as significantly as he's done here, but he did put tariffs on, and he got a fair bit of pressure from senators, well, in those days, governors, of course, and of course, House of Representatives, congresspeople, about their own particular local areas that were suffering because of what's going on with the tariffs. And I think this is one of the arguments that Dominic LeBlanc talked about in the parliamentary committee when he has his discussions with Mr. Ludnick down in Washington. He's basically saying, look, it's in your interest. If you're worried about national security, the best thing you can do is to have a strong trading relationship with your partner right next door that's been in place for years, to do with steel, to do with the auto industry, to deal with aluminum, things of this nature. In other words, if you want to win an argument, all you want to do is get in the guy's face and say you're wrong, you're an idiot, it's not going to happen, especially with a guy like Trump. But if you can say, whoa, listen, I know you've got some problems. This is part of the problem. If we can just back off on these tariffs, then you can come back and the prices are going to start going down. There's going to be less pressure on U.S. government officials, and it's a win-win situation. But it's the sort of thing where we almost have to convince the Americans, especially Trump, I guess, that it's his idea and that it's going to help the American economy. He's not there yet. But you got to keep that argument, and you've got to stay with that line of thinking to convince them in the long term that it's in America's interest to get a better deal for Canada because of the aluminum, because of the steel, because of the auto industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to think that maybe that's happening. We're told that Ludnick, who is the chief negotiator, I guess, pretty much for the United States, has said, yeah, there's some merit in that discussion. Now, that doesn't mean, okay, yeah, you're right, we're going to change everything. But the fact is that they're acknowledging that that's a very valid point, shows us that maybe now they're starting to see the light. But again, that comes back to what John Iverson talked about in his piece. You've got to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. Don't listen to Poilievre. I mean, anybody, whether you're a politician or whether you're a business person or anything, who thinks that you can negotiate a deal with a guy like Trump, or anybody for that matter, in a matter of 5 or 6 months, you're dreaming in Technicolor. That just doesn't happen. As we've mentioned in a previous podcast, it's taken months, sometimes years, to go through some of these trade deals. And it's not going to happen any faster now, all right? So that's where the patience comes in. And it's difficult. I get that. But it seems to be the best path for us to follow right now. And I know that politics comes into this. Poilievre wants you to believe that there's no end in sight and there's no hope in sight. Well, that's not true. All right. Like I say, he's a bitter little man who's just ticked off that he's not the prime minister because he had a huge big point lead of how many months ago now, and it's not going to happen. But don't let him drive the narrative here. The narrative is being driven by the government. That's the people we elected. They're the ones who are at the negotiating table. All right. Poilievre hasn't been anywhere near these negotiations, and probably, hopefully, for the best of Canada, never will be part of those negotiations. But let's let these guys do their job, and let's see if we can get some relief on some of these issues. It's looking pretty bleak. I get that, and we're all starting to feel it now. But now the Americans are starting to feel it. The American consumers are starting to feel it. The American businesses are starting to feel it. And this is where the long-term strategy comes in. So, as John Iverson points out, patience, and American self-interest. You know, when things start to go badly with the U.S. economy, and that's already starting to happen in many different areas, you go back to the table and say, you know what, we've got part of the solution here. If you take those tariffs off steel and aluminum, then all of a sudden that market's going to be open to you guys, and that's going to take the pressure off the U.S. economy. And these guys are economists, in as much as they're beholden to Trump, and their loyalty is to him and not to the American public or to the Constitution. They're also numbers people. And if they can see that there's a business case to say, yeah, you know what, we got to slacken that off because that's going to help us. Yeah, it'll help Canada too, but it's going to help us and take some of the heat off. They're starting to see that. They're not admitting it yet, but they're starting to see that. And that's a good sign. So patience is a virtue. I've been told that a million times, but practicing patience and actually understanding that you're just going to have to suck it up and say, okay, this is for the betterment, and I'm not going to, throw all sorts of trite cliches here, like all good things come to those who wait and stuff like that. I mean, that means nothing to anybody. The fact of the matter is this is big business. This is multi-billion-dollar business. And the guy who's at the table for us, the Prime Minister, who's talked to the President on a number of times, has a wealth of experience in international business and politics. So let's let them do their job and ignore the nattering from the sidelines that you're hearing, because it's just not relevant. That's it for this edition of the podcast. As always, thank you so much for being with us on YouTube. That's great. Good to have you with us here. Hit that notification bell too, would you please, to share that. And thanks as always to everybody who's jumped on side with subscriptions. A lot of great work to do, and we love the dialogue that's going back and forth here. And by subscribing and supporting us, you can help us to continue to do the work that we're doing to try to bring these issues and opinions and facts to these discussions. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.